Hello everyone, welcome back to yet another marvelous video. This one's for all the Stephen King fans out there because in 2007, Frank Darabont released his third Stephen King adaptation, but this one was a far cry from the Shawshank Redemption or the Green Mile. He made The Mist, a film that hits hard and leaves you sitting with it long after the credits roll. Based on King's 1980 novella, the story follows a group of everyday people trapped in a supermarket after a strange unnatural mist rolls into town, bringing something with it, something from another world. But as terrifying as the monsters outside are, the real danger might be the fear and desperation brewing inside. More than a decade later, The Mist is still one of the most unforgettable Stephen King adaptations out there. Today, we're going to look at 30 facts that'll change how you see this film. So, grab some snacks, sit back, and enjoy as we plunge into The Mist. Before we get into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What inspired Stephen King to write the original story? Okay guys, first up, let's get into how exactly King came up with the whole idea. The origins of The Mist go all the way back to 1976. Stephen King had been asked to contribute a short story for an upcoming horror anthology called Dark Forces, but he was stuck. Nothing was working out for him, but all of this changed when a thunderstorm went through Bridgeton, Maine, where King was living at the time with his family. The morning after the storm, he headed to the local grocery store with his son, just trying to grab a few things, but somewhere around the middle aisle, halfway to the hot dog buns, the idea hit him. He pictured a giant prehistoric bird flying through the store, knocking over cans and flapping towards the back by the meat counter. By the time they got to the checkout lane, the story had already started to take shape. People are trapped in a supermarket. There are strange creatures outside. What started as a quick grocery run ended up becoming one of King's most unforgettable nightmares. King ended up writing the novella in 1980, and it's been terrifying readers ever since. But at its core, the entire story was born from that simple, intrusive thought, a random one like most of us have. What if something wrong came crawling out of the mist while you're doing something simple like picking up bread and eggs? How long did Frank Darabont wait to adapt The Mist? Frank Darabont's connection to Stephen King started long before The Shawshank Redemption ever hit screens. Back in the early 80s, Darabont was just getting started when he wrote King a letter asking permission to adapt The Woman in the Room into a short film. King said yes, and that simple gesture helped spark what would become his now famous Dollar Baby program, letting young filmmakers adapt his short stories for just $1. Around that same time, Darabont read The Mist and it stuck with him. Even as his career took off with the writing credits on films like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and The Blob, he kept circling back to it. When the time came to choose his first feature, he was torn between two King novellas, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption and The Mist. He went with Shawshank, but he never let go of this one. Over the years, plenty of other filmmakers came a-knockin', but King kept the rights with Darabont. It wasn't until 2007, almost 2 decades later, that Darabont finally stepped behind the camera and made good on the promise he had made to himself all those years ago. Did you know the original opening was scrapped at an actor's suggestion? Okay, so did you know that The Mist was almost a very different movie? Long before the monsters ever reached the supermarket doors, The Mist was meant to begin somewhere else entirely, not in David Drayton's studio, but inside the heart of a government experiment gone wrong. Frank Darabont's original script opened within the walls of the Arrowhead Project, a military installation that characters in the film only speak of in hushed, fearful tones. In that version, the story didn't leave room for mystery. It showed you exactly where the mist came from, a classified experiment, strange cameras trained on a sealed chamber, and a cluster of scientists nervously pushing forward as a storm raged outside. As the portal opened, we saw just a sliver of light at first, and something began to move on the other side. Then came the lightning, a power surge, the glass cracking under pressure, and then everything collapsed into chaos. It would have been big, but Darabont never shot it. During a dinner with Andre Braugher, who plays the ever-skeptical Brent Norton, the actor casually asked if the film really needed that opening. Darabont sat with that question for a few days and eventually realized the truth. What you don't see is often far more terrifying than what you do. Cutting this scene really did keep the film more mysterious, and looking back, Darabont admitted that even if they had filmed it, he probably would have left it on the cutting room floor anyways. We'll get back to that later. Did a gritty cop show influence The Mist's look? There's something about The Mist that makes it feel different from other horror films. It's not just the monsters or the ending, it's the way the camera moves, and that's not an accident. That raw energy came from a very deliberate decision on Frank Darabont's part, and a crime show inspired it. Before diving into The Mist, Frank Darabont wanted to sharpen his skills for a tighter, grittier kind of filmmaking. Up until then, his major works like Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile were carefully composed and classically shot. But for The Mist, he had something more urgent and more raw in mind. So he turned to television. Darabont directed an episode of The Shield, the groundbreaking FX cop drama known for its fast-paced, handheld camera work, and that experience lit a spark. While on set, he was impressed by the energy the show's crew could capture on such a tight schedule, especially the work of cinematographer Ron Schmidt and his camera operators Billy Gearhart and Richard Cantu. When it came time to shoot The Mist, Darabont didn't hesitate. He brought Schmidt and his team with him, aiming to recreate that same intensity. The result was a horror film that feels like it's unfolding in real time. That decision gave The Mist its edge. It feels like you're actually trapped right there in that supermarket with no safe space to hide behind. A hidden reference to Stephen King's Dark Tower series. The Mist opens in a quiet moment inside David Drayton's art studio, walls covered in striking movie posters, the storm still brewing outside. It's here that we catch a glimpse of David hard at work on a painting that longtime Stephen King fans might recognize. A shadowy gunslinger standing tall against a fading sun. It's none other than Roland Deschain from the Dark Tower series. This wasn't just a fun Easter egg either. Director Frank Darabont later revealed in the film's commentary that he imagined it as a poster for a hypothetical Dark Tower movie being made in the world of The Mist. The painting itself was created by none other than Drew Struzan. Drew is the legendary artist behind the iconic posters for Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Back to the Future. In fact, Darabont went a step further. The entire studio set was modeled after Struzan's real-life workspace, making the scene feel grounded and lived in while quietly paying tribute to one of King's most ambitious universes. Other than the opening nod, The Mist slips in another deeper connection. At one point, Mrs. Carmody utters the line, "My life for you," a phrase that might sound normal to casual viewers, but longtime King readers will recognize it instantly. That line is a recurring one that many dark followers of Walter O'Dim speak, and he's one of the villains in the Dark Tower saga. Did you spot the Stephen King Easter egg on Norm's shirt? In a film packed with monsters and madness, you might have missed one of The Mist's more charming nods to its creator hiding in plain sight right on Norm the Bag Boy's t-shirt. To be fair, you can't really call this plain sight because you have to look really hard to find it. When the mist first comes in and people go around panicking, we see Norm come in. Right before he gets taken away by the monster, even though we don't get a clear view of his t-shirt because of the apron he's wearing, you get a peek of the WKIT logo on it. Casual viewers might brush it off, but for Stephen King fans, it's a sly little Easter egg with real-world connections. WKIT is actually a real radio station based in Bangor, Maine, and it used to be co-owned and operated as a part of Zone Radio Core by Stephen King himself. But as 2024 approached, King announced something that caught local fans off guard. After New Year's Eve, WKIT and its two sister stations would go dark. At 77, King explained that it was time to step back. After decades of keeping the lights on, often by personally covering the station's financial losses. Just when it seemed like the music would stop, two local businessmen stepped in. Greg Hawes and Jeff Solari, both based in Maine, purchased WKIT and formed the Rock Lobster radio group to keep the station running. Their goal wasn't just to buy a business, it was to preserve a piece of local history. Under them, WKIT will continue to broadcast, still rooted in the rock and roll spirit that King helped to cultivate. Stephen King refused a cameo? Well, Stephen King never makes a physical appearance in The Mist, he almost did. According to various accounts, Frank Darabont had originally envisioned a small supporting role for King in the film, but in the end, King turned it down, perhaps preferring to stay behind the scenes on this one. Still, Darabont found a subtle way to sneak the author into the world of the story. If you look closely during scenes near the pharmacy next to the supermarket, you'll spot a little nod. It's named King's Pharmacy. This is a quiet wink to the man whose imagination created this whole thing. There are other subtle references to him in there as well that you might not catch unless you're actively looking for them, and this is one of them. Another is, during an action scene in the film, a man crashes into a spinning wire book rack in the grocery store. If you look at this scene closely, you'll notice that every book that's placed on the shelf is written by Stephen King. Was the giant creature almost left out? One of the most epic moments in The Mist comes towards the end of the film when a huge six-legged behemoth comes in through the fog, an almost mythical creature that feels like it's been ripped straight from a Lovecraftian nightmare. But believe it or not, that moment nearly didn't happen. Despite its roots in one of the novella's most memorable scenes, Frank Darabont initially had no plans to include the giant creature in the film. It was only after several passionate effects artists at Cafe FX urged him to reconsider that the beast found its way back into the story. And it's a good thing they did. It became one of the film's most unforgettable images. How big was the budget for this creature feature? When Frank Darabont was finally ready to bring The Mist to life, he didn't walk into a sea of eager studios with open wallets. Despite his track record with King adaptations, getting this off the ground proved a challenge. Most studios hesitated, wary of the film's grim tone and unconventional ending. Eventually, Darabont found a believer in Bob Weinstein at Dimension Films, but there was a catch. You would have to do it fast and on a low budget. With just $18 million to work with and only weeks to prep sets, design monsters, and plan out the shoot, Darabont and his crew had to move quickly. But rather than seeing the constraints as a limitation, Darabont leaned into them. To him, this approach echoed the spirit of the classic horror films he grew up loving, the kind made with passion, urgency, and not a lot of cash. He later reflected that the challenge became part of the thrill. If he was going to make a horror movie, why not embrace the tradition fully, shoot it fast, cheap, and make every shot count? Did the cast include a voice actor from a previous Mist adaptation? Long before Frank Darabont turned The Mist into a film, Stephen King's novella had already been brought to life, but just not on screen. It was through sound. Back in 1984, a group called the ZBS Foundation adapted The Mist as an experimental audio drama, and trust us, it wasn't your average radio play. ZBS was a creative collective that was based in upstate New York, founded by a guy named Thomas Lopez, though he went by the much cooler pseudonym Meatball Fulton. Lopez was passionate about reviving audio storytelling at a time when it was kind of fading away. By the mid-80s, ZBS was playing with all kinds of cutting-edge recording techniques, and they stumbled onto something pretty wild: the Kunstkopf binaural microphone. This thing looked like a mannequin head. It even had little ears. The idea was to place microphones inside those ears so actors could move around the head while performing. The result was that when you listened through headphones, it felt like you were right there in the room hearing everything unfold in real space. They called it 3D sound, and yeah, it was as immersive as it sounds. So when ZBS got the green light to adapt The Mist, they jumped at the chance to use this immersive tech on a story that's all about fear of the unknown. William Sadler, who you might recognize from the 2007 film version, actually played the lead in the audio version first. In the movie, Thomas Jane took over the role. And here's the thing. The audio drama might even be scarier than the movie. When you take away the visuals and leave just the sound, footsteps in the fog, creatures moving in the distance, panicked breathing right next to your ear, your imagination does all the work. The director, Bill Raymond, really leaned into the chaos. Characters talk over each other, scenes echo and drift around you, some voices are right in your ear while others feel like they're coming from across the room. It's disorienting, and that's exactly the point. This 1984 adaptation may not be as well known as the film, but if you're brave enough to plug in some headphones and give it a listen, do check it out. Why did Frank Darabont turn down $30 million? Long before The Mist made it to the screen, Frank Darabont had a version of the story, and especially its gut-punch ending, etched firmly in his mind. So, when a producer came along offering a generous $30 million budget to make the film, it seemed like a dream deal until the catch surfaced. In exchange for the bigger budget, Darabont would have to rewrite the final moments of the movie, scrapping the very ending he had spent 2 decades dreaming about. Instead of compromising, Darabont walked away. It was after this that he turned to Bob Weinstein and agreed to make the film for just $18 million. Darabont gave up his own director's salary for this, and for him, protecting the integrity of the ending was worth more than any paycheck. Temperature manipulated to create the Mist's effect. To create the signature look of the Mist, Frank Darabont and his team relied heavily on practical effects, and one of the most ingenious came from the special effects coordinator, Daryl Pritchett. Instead of relying only on CGI, he came up with a smart way to keep the fog just outside the interior of the grocery store set, maintaining a consistent boundary between the safety of the store and outside. This involved a lot of trial and error during the prep, but once it was properly done, it worked really well. For example, to film the loading dock scene, they used a tented environment to keep the mist outside. They also carefully adjusted the temperature and air pressure inside the set to make this work. They could actually influence the movement of the fog by cooling down the room, which caused it to pull back or settle exactly where they needed. This method actually gave the film a quality that digital effects alone could not replicate. It's a great example of how science and old-school movie magic can work together to bring horror to life. Sounds pretty cool, right? Did Thomas Jane refuse a Punisher reference? In one of the quieter moments, amid the chaos of The Mist, David Drayton stops in the pharmacy to grab a comic book for his son, an opportunity director Frank Darabont saw as the perfect spot for a subtle nod. His idea was to have David pick up a copy of The Punisher War Journal, referencing Thomas Jane's role as the vigilante anti-hero just a few years earlier, but Jane wasn't interested. After a falling out with the producers behind the Punisher franchise and choosing not to return for the sequel, he decided he didn't want to include the reference at all. Instead, the comic David picks up is an issue of Hellboy, a more personal touch meant as a quiet shout-out to Ron Perlman. Other hidden comics created by friends. There's another blink and you'll miss it comic that makes an appearance in this movie. Right after David gets an issue of Hellboy from the rack, if you look closely, you'll spot this one. It's The Goon, a cult favorite series published by Dark Horse. This wasn't just a random prop either. Director Frank Darabont is a longtime fan of The Goon and a close friend of its creator, Eric Powell. Darabont even wrote the foreword for the third volume of the graphic novel series. Powell reportedly visited the set during filming, and the comic's appearance in the pharmacy was likely Darabont's quiet nod to that friendship. Did the pharmacy scene pay tribute to aliens? While Frank Darabont hasn't explicitly confirmed this one, there is a reference to aliens in the film. I mean, the parallels are hard to miss for fans of sci-fi horror. When David Drayton and his group enter the pharmacy to search for supplies, they stumble into bodies suspended against the walls, cocooned in sticky webbing, with alien spider creatures moving all around. This moment is a direct visual callback to the iconic chestburster nest scene from Aliens. The Grey Widower's acidic webbing feels like a clever nod to the xenomorph's infamous acid blood. It's pretty clear the influence is there. Bridgeton, Maine, a real place? Stephen King has a habit of turning small-town charm into pure nightmare fuel. Across so many of his stories, the scariest stuff doesn't happen in some haunted castle or distant forest. It happens right in people's homes or in the quiet streets of their hometown. And that's no accident. King grew up in Maine, and you can feel that influence everywhere in his work. While many of his iconic settings are fictional, they're all shaped by King's own upbringing in Maine. His deep familiarity with small-town life adds a layer of unsettling realism. These places feel lived in, ordinary, until they're not. That's what makes them so disturbing. In the case of The Mist, Bridgeton, Maine is actually a real town, but Stephen King gave it a fictionalized twist. The story is set in the town of Bridgeton, which does actually exist in western Maine. Many people might just assume that Bridgeton is just another one of King's fictional towns, but it is a small scenic town near lakes and forests, very much the kind of place you would imagine weird supernatural fog creeping into. Did the cast know about the ending? One of the most unforgettable aspects of The Mist is its ending, a bleak and brutal twist that takes a hard turn from Stephen King's original story. In King's novella, the story ends on an uncertain, almost hopeful note, but Frank Darabont had something else in mind. For the film, he went full tragedy. After running out of gas and watching hope evaporate, David makes an unthinkable decision. He mercy kills the remaining survivors, including his young son. Moments later, help arrives. The mist begins to lift, the military rolls in, and the unbearable truth hits. David's choice was horrifying. Waiting just a few more minutes could have saved all of them. It's a gut-wrenching finale, one that left audiences stunned and still sparks debates years later, but most of the cast and crew didn't even know that was how the film was gonna end. Darabont was so protective of the twist that he kept the final pages of the script under wraps. Only the small group working on the last day of filming got the full picture. Everyone else was left in the dark, just like the characters themselves. Did the budget restrict a major scene? Okay guys, we already talked about how Andre Braugher played a role in changing the film's opening scene. Did you know that the budget was also a major reason for this change? Horror films have a long-standing tradition. They start with the moment everything goes horribly wrong. And originally, The Mist was going to follow that formula. But if you've seen the final film, you'll know that's not how it opens. So why cut that dramatic opening? A mix of reasons, and we already looked at a few. Some folks working on the film were actually excited about the original idea, and cinematographer Ron Schmidt thought it would have been a blast to shoot. King's King's novella didn't really explain much, so showing the incident could have added something fresh. Ultimately, the decision came down to time and money. Darabont had grand ideas, but the budget just didn't stretch far enough. The Mist only had $18 million to work with and only about 34 days to shoot, a stark contrast to the 71 days he had for Shawshank Redemption or the 105 he had for Green Mile. In the end, that opening sequence was left on the cutting room floor before it was even shot, not just to keep up the suspense, but also to cut costs. An even more devastating ending. Did you guys know that there was another twist that was planned? Frank Darabont had one more gut punch planned for the end of The Mist, but it never made it to the screen. In the film's final moments, after David makes the unthinkable decision, a military convoy arrives, revealing that help was moments away. One of the trucks carries Melissa McBride's character, the woman who left the store early on to find her kids, proving she made it out alive. But Darabont originally wanted to take the tragedy even further. His plan was for a second truck to follow behind, filled with familiar faces from the supermarket: Jim, Bud, Mr. Mackey, and even many of the people who once stood behind Mrs. Carmody. The idea was to show that most of them had actually been rescued after all, and that David and his group would have been too if they had just stayed put. It would have added one final twist of the knife, forcing David and the audience to process the idea that everything that happened in the last act was completely avoidable. But that scene never happened. By the time they were filming the ending, many of the extras and supporting cast had already wrapped and left the set. Without the people needed to fill that second truck, the scene had to be scrapped. Did you know that the cast helped with the shooting? Shooting The Mist was no easy task. With so many characters crammed into the supermarket set, the crew had to find a way to keep up with all of the chaos. Camera operators Billy Gearhart and Richard Cantu were constantly on the move, sometimes even nudging actors aside just to swing the lens towards someone else mid-scene. But here's the cool part. The cast actually leaned into that madness. Thomas Jane and Marcia Gay Harden both talked about how casual and improvisational the whole filming process was. At times, they were more than just actors performing for the camera, they were part of the filming process. If Jane felt a moment was happening over someone's shoulder, he would point the camera in that direction. Harden too would help guide the operators to where the emotion really was. It wasn't about being flashy, it was about capturing the moment as it unfolded, almost like a documentary. And with an unpredictable film like this, that style seems to have worked out really well. The Mercedes mishap. In one shot, Brent Norton's Mercedes sits crushed beneath a fallen tree, but what you might not know is that the car was actually a rental, and the production wasn't supposed to do any real damage to it. The original agreement was that they could use the vehicle as is, since it had already been in an accident and was headed for repairs. As long as they didn't make things worse, it was fine. But somewhere along the way, that memo got lost. By the time the scene was over, the upholstery had been torn up, the body had fresh dents, the paint was scratched, and production was hit with a bill for thousands in unexpected damage. Producer Denise Huth later admitted that it wasn't their proudest moment, it was a huge mistake that could have been avoided with better communication. Did Stephen King support the ending? Changing the ending of a beloved Stephen King story is no small thing. For most filmmakers, it would have been a risky move, especially when you're taking a bleak novella and making it even darker. But for Frank Darabont, The Mist needed a real brutal conclusion, something that hit hard. The kind of ending that didn't let you off easy. At the time he was writing the film, Darabont was wrestling with a lot of frustration about the state of the world, the country, and maybe even the film industry itself. That anger bubbled into the finale, giving birth to one of the most shocking and emotionally devastating endings in horror cinema. He thought, and rightly so, that it shouldn't always be a happy ending, and that makes sense because it's not always that way in life. But Darabont didn't move forward with this lightly. Before locking it in, he turned to the one person whose opinion truly mattered, Stephen King. If King had rejected it, that would have been the end of the road, but instead, King embraced the change. He loved it, and even wished that he had come up with it himself. He saw the power in it, and he also shared how, once in a while, there should be a movie that just angers the audience with the way it ends. And with that blessing, Darabont knew he had something unforgettable. Stephen King doesn't scare easily. After all, he's the one writing the nightmares. But when he saw Frank Darabont's adaptation of The Mist, he admitted it genuinely frightened him. There's a quick but memorable jump scare in The Mist, the one where William Sadler suddenly slams his hand against the glass door. It's a classic move, the kind of scare you've probably seen 100 times in horror movies, but during Stephen King's first viewing of the film, it actually made him jolt in his seat. For Darabont, that reaction was everything. Challenges with the pharmacy scene. The most terrifying moment in The Mist has to be the pharmacy sequence. It's the part where a handful of survivors venture from the grocery store into King's pharmacy in search of medical supplies, but instead of help, they found themselves surrounded by massive spiders hiding in the fog. For cinematographer Ron Schmidt, this wasn't just the scariest part of the film, it was also the most technically challenging. The scene was originally written to take place during the day, which made things way harder. In a nighttime sequence, you can play with shadows, tuck monsters away in the darkness, and control where the scares pop out. But in this case, Schmidt had to hide creatures in an environment that was flooded with a thick white mist. The pharmacy's power is out, which gave Schmidt a little wiggle room with darkness, but it still wasn't easy. To make it work, he spent a lot of time experimenting. On his days off, he tested different mixes of fill light, flashlight, and smoke using a still camera. It became a process of trial and error to find that spot where the mist was dense enough to feel eerie, but not so overwhelming that it swallowed up the creatures or ruined the contrast needed for jump scares. After Schmidt and the effects team figured out how to control the mist on set, he was able to plan out how much contrast they would need to bring back in post-production during color correction. The end result was a scene that still burned into the brains of horror fans. The actors had to light their own scenes. Back when The Mist was being filmed, the cast didn't have the luxury of iPhones to light up their faces in dark scenes. The first iPhone wasn't even invented yet. Instead, the crew had to get creative, especially during the intense pharmacy sequence we just talked about. That entire scene was lit almost entirely using nothing but flashlights. Cinematographer Ron Schmidt faced a unique challenge during this. Not only did he have to make the scene visually coherent through thick smoke and shaky chaos, but the actors themselves had to help light it. All the actors in this scene, William Sadler, Thomas Jane, and Jeffrey DeMunn, were involved with the lighting as well. They had to ensure that these creatures weren't revealed before the close-up. Frances Sternhagen, who played Irene Rippler, even had her own flamethrower, which helped with lighting the way. For example, when William Sadler's character recoils in horror as baby spider creatures erupt from a cocoon body, Sadler was actually holding and aiming a flashlight to illuminate his own reaction. By that point in filming, the trust between Schmidt and the cast was strong enough that he could direct lighting cues right into their performances. He would say something and the actors would pull it off mid-scene without missing a beat. It was a perfect collaboration. The fog machines had to be timed just right, the actors had to stay sharp both with their movements and their makeshift lighting. The camera team had to move through the tight set smoothly, and it all paid off. The pharmacy sequence remains one of the most terrifying moments in the film, not just because of what's on screen, but because of the teamwork behind the camera that made it feel so real. Was the film actually shot in Maine? Although The Mist takes place in a small Maine town, all the exterior scenes were actually shot just outside of Shreveport, Louisiana. This setting was so convincing as New England that when Stephen King first watched the film, he apparently turned to Frank Darabont and asked if they had actually filmed it in Maine itself. The landscape, the mood, and the weather all captured the vibe so well that it even fooled the man who was from there. The way they were able to pull this off so convincingly says a lot about the team's attention to detail. Who designed the monsters in The Mist? To bring the nightmarish creatures of The Mist to life, Frank Darabont teamed up with special effects master Greg Nicotero, and together they assembled a small team of creative minds to design the film's terrifying creatures. One of the biggest names involved was Bernie Wrightson, the legendary horror artist and co-creator of Swamp Thing. Wrightson's eerie style helped shape several of the film's more memorable beasts, including the huge monster that shows up in the final moments. The spider-like monsters in the pharmacy scene started off a lot closer to how Stephen King described them in the novella. Artist Jordu Shell built early maquettes based on that original vision, but as the designs developed, Frank Darabont wanted to push things in a creepier direction. He wanted the spiders to have something resembling a human grin, and they didn't just put a guy's head on a spider. Instead, designer Mike Broom and Nicotero landed on something far subtler and scarier, mandibles that fold over the creature's mouth in just the right way to suggest a skeletal grinning face. How did the crew use shots to heighten chaos? Frank Darabont took a very hands-on, almost theatrical approach to The Mist. He didn't want it to feel like just another horror movie, he wanted it to feel like a pressure cooker, with fear and paranoia constantly simmering. He and cinematographer Ron Schmidt went for a handheld approach, letting the camera move almost like another character in the room. It was all about catching the energy in real time without the actors worrying about where the lens was pointing. You have a bunch of terrified strangers locked in a grocery store while horrors lurk outside. But instead of uniting, they start turning on each other. The camera's constant movement and tight framing captured that growing sense of claustrophobia and desperation, especially as Mrs. Carmody's cult gained traction and the store descended into full-on chaos. While those handheld shots kept things grounded, Darabont and Schmidt still used wide angles when it mattered, especially when showing the vast, mist-covered unknown just beyond the store's doors. There was a lot of improv on set too. Darabont encouraged the actors to react naturally, often letting scenes characters unfold with minimal direction. That spontaneity gave everything an added realistic touch. All of the arguments, the fear, the abandonment of civility all felt alarmingly human. For the bigger moments, like scenes of full-blown panic or mob violence, Schmidt went with wide overhead lenses. Those shots make the characters look small, overwhelmed, and helpless, exactly what they were. And to make sure those scenes had a consistent tone, the same background actors were brought back again and again for crowd shots, which really helped sell it. How does the movie's ending differ from the novella? Frank Darabont knew from the start that he didn't want The Mist to end on a hopeful note. In Stephen King's original novella, the story leaves things wide open. David and the others drive off into the endless fog, unsure of what's waiting for them out there. It's vague, unsettling, and totally appropriate for the story. David and a few survivors are still driving, still searching, their fates unresolved as the mist stretches on. It's ambiguous, but there is a thread of possibility. Maybe there is something or someone out there. But Darabont felt that that kind of ending wouldn't land the same way on screen. He wanted something that would leave the audience reeling. Interestingly though, the seeds of that brutal movie ending were already planted in King's story. At one point, David quietly notes that there are only 3 bullets left and 4 people in the car. It's a grim little thought tossed into the mix of his anxious inner monologue, and King never takes it any further. But Darabont saw that moment and ran with it. Instead of letting the characters disappear into the mist with some kind of hope, the film plays out that darkest possibility. When it seems like there's no escape, David makes the impossible decision, and the consequences are unforgettable. Did you know about the TV series that came after? The Mist hit theaters in 2007 and made a strong impression right out of the gate. It pulled in around 57 million globally and was met with solid praise from both critics and audiences. Over time, it has made a reputation for itself as one of the most powerful and haunting Stephen King adaptations ever put to screen. But the story didn't end there. A few years later, in 2013, there were plans to bring The Mist back. This time as a TV series. Dimension decided to take another stab at the material, with Bob Weinstein announcing the show in development. The series eventually premiered on Spike in the summer of 2017, reimagining the concept with a new cast and setting. Unfortunately, it never really found its footing, and after just 1 season, it was quietly canceled that fall. Marvelous verdict! Well, with that guys, we've come to the end of yet another fun video. We hope you enjoyed this one as much as we did. The Mist is surely one of the best Stephen King adaptations out there, and if you haven't watched the film before, apologies for the spoilers, but you should still totally check it out. Now, we want to hear from you. Did you already know most of these facts? Were there any that were surprising? Also, are there any that we missed? We'd love to hear about them in the comments section down below. Also, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.